Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we're glad to have you with us. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to City Awake. My name is Afua Ankara, and I lead business operations for the Global Government Affairs and Policy function of Bluebird Bio. I'm also a member of the City Awake Advisory Board and will be your moderator for today's program. City Awake is the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce's premier young professional platform. Through our City Awake programming, we work to elevate young professional voices to engage in the most pressing issues facing our region. With City Awake, we get to celebrate incredible talent in the greater Boston area, like today's speaker. Today's discussion focuses on a very important topic as we all continue to recover from the past year. Given that food security and supporting a community is a priority for Lovin Spoonfuls. And today we'll hear about the organization's journey and the ways we, the next generation of leaders, can get involved in supporting a community too. I'd be remiss to say that these conversations could not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors, the Bar Foundation, John Hancock, and PG Gillette. Before we get started, I want to flag that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page in the coming weeks. I want to also encourage you to leverage the chat and Q&A functions during today's discussion. We want to be sure we answer all the questions that you have. So to get started, I'd like to welcome Ashley Stanley, founder of Lovin Spoonfuls, to come on camera and provide a brief introduction of herself.
Hi, Afua.
Hi there.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Chamber and all the sponsors for making today possible. I am the founder and executive director of Lovin Spoonfuls. We're about 11 years old and we're a food rescue organization. And that means that we take food that's otherwise being thrown away and then upcycle it into the social service stream. Over the last 11 years, we've rescued over 20 million pounds of food. And during COVID alone, during 2020, that was over 4 million pounds just in that time frame. On a weekly average, we rescue between 80 and 85,000 pounds each week, and we serve about 33,000 people each week as well. So that just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what we do, and I'm looking forward to our conversation as to why we do it.
Welcome, Ashley. Thank you for that. Such monumental work done by the organization, such important work as well. Thank you for joining us. So let's get started, just like you said. And like you mentioned, it's recorded that nearly 1 in 4 households experienced food insecurity in 2020. And in 2021, more than 42 million people are estimated to lack reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. With adults and children are affected by hunger, and they can experience serious consequences ranging from poor productivity in their daily life to being at greater risk of physical and mental illness, including hypertension and diabetes. So let's start with this. Why do you believe it's important for the Boston community or business community to bring more attention to food insecurity and become more involved in connecting community resources to serve those in need?
So that's a great question. And I think one of the things that 2020 really showed us was truly how connected we are, whether we see it or not, and then what really happens in that disconnect. So in terms of food insecurity, we look at Massachusetts, one of the most well-resourced states in the country, the most well-resourced country in the world, and the disconnects and the inability to really reach each corner of the community to make sure that people were healthy, that they were fed, and that they had basic resources just became illuminated in a way that I think hasn't been before. So in my work and across our network of partners, whether it's in the nonprofit space, the social service space, we often hear the term disproportionately affected communities. I really think that this was the first time that the community at large has really understood what that term means and started to understand that systematically, as a whole, there are parts of our neighborhoods, our community, our state, our country that truly cannot access what they need to be healthy, and for all the reasons that you mentioned. So anywhere from kids being able to learn and be healthy and sort of, show up to fulfill what they want in their lives, to the very basic choices of parents having to choose between heat or food or gas in their car to go look for a job or to figure out how to take public transportation to get to a grocery store. All of these things are happening next door to us. And I think right now is really an opportunity for us to understand what we need to do as a full community to help each other.
I appreciate that. And I believe that visibility will really help make some great systematic changes that will benefit all of us, right? When people reach their, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when people just meet those basic needs, they're able to realize their full potential, and we all win as a society when that happens.
Absolutely. And we have said from day one that we believe that food is a right. It's not a privilege, particularly healthy food. Lovin Spoonfuls really focuses on fresh produce, lean proteins, dairy, whole grains. And as such, our entire fleet of trucks is temperature controlled and refrigerated to make sure that we can get healthier options into the social service stream. And so really making sure that food is sort of a universal shared experience, but also a biological necessity, is valued as such.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't think, you look at third world countries and you don't think of it, and it's just in your backyard, right? Right. Well, stepping back for a minute, can you give a brief overview about how Lovin Spoonfuls came to be?
Yeah, in a word, an accident. And it's probably anticlimactic, but I don't have a background in nonprofit. I did not have a background in food service. I have been around sort of charity, philanthropy. My family large foundation, and so I really sort of growing up started to think that I understood the dynamic of charity or philanthropy or what that looked like, and as I got older and got into the world, I really started to wonder, does charity truly mean that problems are being solved? Is it cutting checks to organizations so they can stay in business? Are they actually solving the problem? And all of those questions, I think, were sort of just always maybe lying a little dormant in my mind. I'm from Wellesley, Massachusetts, and I had moved back to Boston about 12, 13 years ago now, after being away for some time. And I was turning 30, and all of these, different life things were happening. And I heard on the radio, we were just getting into fall, just getting into autumn. And I heard on the radio sort of the beginning of charity season, right? Like different organizations were putting out their commercials. We need money, we need toys, we need your donations to make sure the families can have a good Thanksgiving. As we get ready for Christmas, we're doing a toy drive, we're doing a clothing drive, all of these things. And it just sort of occurred to me that messaging around service has not changed since I was a kid. So I just gave away how old I was, but in all of that time and over all that time, I think what really sort of struck me in that moment was saying, do we need to look at things differently? And I happened to be sitting down to a meal, and I happened to be looking at sort of the food on the table and around me. And not only was there enough, but there was plenty, and there was so much. And over the next few days, I really started to think, are we asking the right questions? Food doesn't seem like a problem of supply. It seems a problem of distribution. And how do we tackle it from that standpoint? And that was really sort of the foundation for Lovin Spoonfuls.
I love that. I love that you're reflecting upon your life and your values and your privileges, and we're able to see how you could bridge the gap in an area of need. And that's really wonderful. And I think you also just mentioned that the different components of charity and how to really make an impact. And what I got from it was community organizing beyond just, cutting checks. Community organizing around issues like this have proven essential for getting people's voices heard and enacting real change. So what are some community-based organizations that people can reach out to, and if they're looking to get more involved in the anti-hunger movement? And are there any projects in the works that we can expect to see in the future from you all?
Yeah, and I mean, that's such an important part of it, right? Because you really try and look at sort of, or at least the way that we look at it, we look at our work as a measure of justice. We work in the nonprofit space, right? So we are a 501c3. And part of that was there was just no, I hate to put it this way, but there was no market for food rescue that offered the proper value, not just to the food, but ultimately to our end user, to that person who can't easily or consistently access that fresh, healthy food. And it became a matter of how do we do this in a way that we're going to be able to launch and we're going to be able to do it. So as a logistics company in the nonprofit space, we sort of had to be, multifaceted in the way that we reached out to the community and the way that we sort of took care of our partners on both sides, our vendors, which you have our grocery stores, farms, wholesalers, what have you, and then our beneficiaries, our end users. And within that, there has to be community buy-in, right? So we have to be able to offer the platform to say, how do we reach folks in these neighborhoods and in these communities? So they know what's going on. It might inform them where they want to shop, where they want to spend their money. They want to know what businesses they're supporting that are also supporting us and supporting the community. Because I think when we talk about food and sort of a place to access that, whether you're a customer or you're living in the community and you can't necessarily patronize grocery store X, but you can get to the community center, or you can get a delivery, or you can figure out how can I also benefit from what's available. So over the years, we've really tried to connect with the community in a number of different ways, and whether that's through our board of directors, through our friends of Lovin Spoonfuls, through our friends of Lovin Spoonfuls advisory board. We're just now starting to launch our community advisory boards, which are statewide in the areas that we serve, which are really meant to inform the work that we're doing by geography. So our model will always look the same in terms of logistics, but the geography and the demographics are certainly different. So what's happening here in, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan is going to be different from Springfield and Hampden County, but the approach is very much the same and the model is the same. So we want to make sure we understand what's happening in the communities that we serve.
I love the no one size fit all approach that's taking. So it allows, I imagine it allows you to create localized and regionalized solutions to really then reach your audience and people that you're serving.
100%. I think we've learned more about trucking and logistics and figuring out fleet management than any of us ever thought. But the other thing about food is that it is so personal, right? So even by geography, by demographic, it also means by diet, by cultural heritage, by the ability to have choice in what you're eating or what you're feeding your family for whatever reason is important to you. I'm a second generation American, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So there was something very, very personal to me about folks being able to have complete ownership over something as personal as food for themselves and their family.
I love that. And given that too, in recent times with COVID, it's shed a light on a lot of these issues that we've just discussed. And it's also reminded us of the extreme inequities that's embedded within our culture. So how do we seize this moment to address not only the societal issues, but also environmental and civic and community problems? And how can employers bring an equity lens to own their own food rescue work?
I mean, that's the question of our time, and whether or not it has come too late, that will be determined. But what I think, or what I hope we're all experiencing is if there wasn't effort prior, or there wasn't sort of a willingness to engage from that kind of equity lens prior, that we've all been collectively forced into doing that now. Part of this is really understanding the need to be honest and tell the truth, and to be able to look at our communities and say, how have we built these communities? How have we built our food system? How have we built the ability or the barrier for folks to be able to participate in an equal way? And you had mentioned at the very beginning, identifying privilege is important. And I think for me, and as I've gone through the last year with everybody else, it's privilege is not the extra things that somebody has, or the extra ability, or it's the absence of the barriers that made things possible. And so trying to do this work and break down barriers that keep people from being able to access healthy food, but B, being able to participate in their own life in a meaningful way that gives them sort of upward mobility. That's really been a focus for us. And so we try and engage our whole team. We try and engage our employees. We try and engage our communities. That's where the community advisory boards are going to be so important for us here, but really trying to understand that we're living in a world that needs to be available to everybody. And how can we all do our parts to make that happen? Even if it seems like a lofty goal, being able to speak truthfully and get educated about each part of it is really important.
Society thrives on lofty goals. If you don't reach them, you at least work towards a world that's better for most of us or all of us, just to have a society where we can really, everybody can live up to their full potential. And I think I mentioned before, once one of us wins, we all win. So what are some of the basic strategies that you think businesses should consider? I know you've talked about how the work that you're doing with the advisory board and connecting to the localities and bringing those insights to shape your work. But if there's a business listening to this, what are some of the basic strategies that they can apply, things that are a bit more agnostic to?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is so important for folks to understand is there are pieces of hunger that are, and the fundamentals of hunger that are entirely political, and we are not politicians or policymakers. So we're working in the space that has been allotted to us or that we've been able to carve out. But what we can do is figure out how we want to run our businesses, how we want to interact with the community at large, and how we want to try and be influential in society. And so that means looking at our own company's sustainability, right? Looking at the environmental piece of all of this, because we are all sharing the same planet. Our hiring practices, our internal policies and core values. We have a board member who's one of my mentors, and I remember the first time a colleague and I went up to meet him at his very impressive offices. They had these little cards they were just stood up in what looked like little picture frames in massive offices, but there were just these little cards, and they were core values and bills of rights for employees. And that was so significant to see. And so we've adopted a version of that and really try and say, okay, if we are truly trying to bring justice, equity, good service, good value into the community, we have to create it internally first. And I've always thought that you can't, you sort of can't give away what you don't have, or what you're at least not trying to, or what you're at least trying to cultivate internally. And so those things I think are integral to the way that Lovin Spoonfuls runs. A fundamental value for me has always been, it's not necessarily what you do, but it's how you do it. And I think that can really shape sort of who we are as an organization, but really people in the world.
So living up to the values, creating those values, having those values as guidances, and also really walking the walk is what I'm getting.
Chop wood, carry water. I mean, there's really no shortcut to making sure that your business can run sustainably, that you're financially healthy, that your employees are taken care of in every way, shape, or form. And we're talking living wage, benefits, making sure that there are mental health services. COVID was a massive strain on really everybody. Folks working in social service who were looking at such extreme increased need, it took a toll. We had our FRCs coming back at the end of the days, and their hearts were just ripped out. And I think you do that over and over again after having lifted and distributed upwards of 4,000 pounds of food a day. There's some fatigue there, and you have to make sure that you have a place and that you create space for folks to go with that. And that's the only way you can ask your employees to bring themselves to work in a way that makes sense.
So it sounds like, would you agree that, or what do you think employees are paying attention to, besides the values, placing the values and the guidelines to approach to make sure you walk the walk and you serve your needs? Do you find employees are paying attention to employer stance on public policy issues like food security? I know we're not policymakers, but we can, businesses can influence the shape and direction in the communities that they work in. And if you find that to be true. Why do you think it's important for young professionals to prioritize food security?
So yes, I 100% think that employees are watching, and they should be. There should be attachment in some way to what they're doing, or at least I think so, in order to have a full experience. I think they're paying attention to if we're not necessarily affecting policy. And I will say we have had some influence when the DEP put in the food waste ban, 2014, I believe it was now. So there are ways that we are able to influence the space that we work in, but internal policy is important, right? How do we behave? And we engage folks in questions, right? Or we engage their questions when they say, so who do we take money from? Who are our partners? Who do we work with? Why do we make those decisions? I think that kind of transparency is really important so that folks understand really sort of running a thread through the entire company. As far as food insecurity as an issue that should be important to employees, to anyone walking down the street. Again, food is the most universal experience we can have. It's a language that's understood by everybody. So as a human being, you and I met 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago now. Both of us have the same biological needs when it comes to food. Our tastes might be different, our allergies might be different, whatever. But to wake up in the morning and survive, we need that. And I think when we're able to start looking at our community, our neighbors, our neighborhoods, we don't know who we might be passing blindly on the street, who might live in our neighborhood, but might be utilizing our local food pantry, right? We don't know if a CEO of business doesn't know if their employees are utilizing food pantry. It's something that's extremely personal. And I think that's why we need to really be in tune with at least making sure that resources are available.
That community and comprehensive approach always reminds me of that, where I always think of if we lived in a society where we all were able to just meet those basic needs, imagine how far we can go with innovation, with advancement. It's a beautiful thought and something, and I hope that we as a community here in Boston, the world beyond Boston, can get to. But like you said, maybe too lofty of a goal.
It's a beautiful thought. It's a lofty goal. But again, when we get into sort of pointing it back to political sort of not platforms, but sort of standpoints, hunger itself is political, right? So the antidote here, living wage. We can certainly choose to pay a living wage. There are employers who can choose to pay a living wage. That's how you get folks participating in the economy. That's how you get folks participating in their community, in their life. And then we become stronger, more competitive, and you see very clear paths for upward mobility in that way. It has to come from the ability to participate. And that's where access is so important.
How do we make that case to businesses? I think, part probably through strategic relationships and partnerships. How are you doing it? And what's advice for maybe a business that's thinking about getting into public issues like this, or community-based issues, but they're not really clear how to start? So what are some advice around strategic partnerships, or even exploring where to kick off and where to jumpstart your involvement with your community?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll be frank, as a 501c3, as a nonprofit, we have a little bit of a built-in entree to say, care about what you're doing, because we have a very defined space in sort of the fabric of community in terms of business. When we're talking about the business community at large, businesses, you sort of have to employ some kind of ESG concept within your company these days, right? Like everybody who's coming out of business school, everybody who's coming out of their last year of education and looking to get into the workforce, they want to know that there's a commitment to cultural and social issues. And that's really the next generation that I think we're going to see in the workforce that's going to be the largest portion of our workforce. People want to know that they are choosing to go work for companies that are offering them a full suite of satisfaction, of return, but mostly the ability to be in the world in a meaningful way. And people are going to use their employers to do that.
For sure. Do you have any tangible examples from your experience of how your employees have felt that kind of connection, that bigger calling, if you might say, with working with your organization?
I don't want to speak for anyone, but I feel confident that should you reach out or ask, I think folks would say on the whole, whether they're working on the road as an FRC in our trucks, you're not doing that work if you're not connected. It's not easy. On a 100-degree day, on a 2-degree day, when it's snowing, sleeting, you're moving your truck and, you have cars, whizzing by you wherever. You're doing that because you care and you have a connection to your beneficiary, right? And so I see our FRCs come back to the office at the end of the day and they're truly talking about our partners by name, by what they need, by relationship, how they're doing. They're updating each other in that way. I think off the road and here, in the office, we are able to have conversations about being part of a community that's trying to change and a community that's trying to do a little bit better. And it is really frustrating. It can be really sad. And also really inspiring. And I think the intersection of those three is sort of why social service like this exists.
Yeah, I'm going to switch a little off to some audience questions. We have some really great questions coming in, some great engagement. One that just came in was, what would you say to those who are newly entering the activist spaces and looking to get more involved in supporting the community?
Active in the what space? Sorry.
Entering the activist spaces, just social good, doing things to better advance the community and et cetera.
Great question. I do think there's a difference between activism and work as sort of a space, right? And so I think here, getting into social service, the first piece is really being educated, right? Really understanding sort of what the landscape is. And when Lovin Spoonfuls began, I tried to get meetings with anybody who would take them with me on the retail side, the wholesale side, the social service side. So I met with, food banks. I met with food pantries. I tried to understand, what do you need? What are the gaps in service? If there was going to be an additional solution that we put forward, I want to make sure it's not duplicative. And I want to make sure that it makes sense and it's addressing something that someone needs. And then when you get into sort of the social justice space, understanding fully what's really important to you and then why, that why is so personal. And I think when you get out and you have the sort of, patchwork of folks who are marching or they're at a rally or they're creating a new company or whatever it is, making sure that there is some intentionality around that is really important, because that's how things get done. Otherwise it can get lost.
I can't agree more. Having the why, just as you did with looking at food and making that connection to Lovin Spoonfuls, if you don't have the why that connects you to that cause, it sometimes just ends flat. There's a question around how can organizations make a difference regarding unused food from grocery stores, farmers market, other sellers to help those struggling during the recovery of this pandemic?
So that's exactly what Lovin Spoonfuls does. I'm not sure if that's a company who has its own inventory of food.
We don't have more information on that.
So no, that's okay. So I'll give two scenarios. One, if you are a grocer, a retailer, a wholesaler, what have you, our operations department, works to onboard, whether it's a large brand, a small store. We, certainly have poundage minimums, things like that. But that is why our company exists. As a large company that might be doing, and certainly COVID has probably changed all of this, but what we used to say, if somebody is doing catered lunches every day, if somebody's doing large they have food inventory in their building, there are always ways to start looking at intentionally ordering. Right? I think it's so easy to order food for 300 people when you haven't taken a head count about who might be in the office, or if you only get 20 people that day, and then you've got hundreds of pounds of food that don't make it to people. So I think that's something that's really important. And then upcycling within your own business, right? Understanding how can this either be repurposed, saved, used, given away, something like that. So I think the first thing, again, it always comes back to really getting educated about what kind of resources somebody has internally.
Sure. And I think what I also gathered from what you just said is food waste is also a threat to food security.
Without question, the reason why we started, and it's gotten a little bit better in the last 11 years, so I'm pleased about that. When we started, about 40% of the food that was being produced in this country was being thrown away. Right now, we're hovering at about 35%. So there's been some improvement. And I think when folks understand options like food recovery, the way we do it, compost, recycling, things like that, I think that becomes really influential in the way that people manage their own food.
For sure. So I'm originally from Ghana, and seeing the way that we grow food there, or their relationship with foods, for example, I'll probably use a tomato that's a little softer, but moving here and being in college with friends and et cetera, the amount of waste or just relationship with it, I think education is really needed there to help to kind of bolster that.
For sure.
We have a great question here on what innovation and technology related opportunities have been investigated to adapt to achieving food security.
So that's such a great question, and one that I get all the time. And I think I've seen hundreds of like food waste apps launch over the last couple of years. And food is a really tricky thing, right? Because you're talking, essentially, you think you're talking about inventory management, and you think you're talking about very straightforward data. The food is here, it needs to go here. Let's make it happen. When you're talking about perishable food, which is again where we focus, it's challenging to make sure that you've got sort of eyes and management on all the different factors that can affect the health of that food, the storage of that food, the temperature of that food, and then the ability to serve it. In 1996, Bill Clinton, at the time, he had passed the Emerson Act, which offers federal protection, and now most states have state protection that mirrors that allows folks to donate food in good faith. I think the in good faith part is where we really like to drill down here, right? Because what you want to do is you want to be able to really understand, the cold chain and then chain of command, and know where the food has been and where it's going. So it's very easy to look at sort of an app and say, you've got, X pallets of X food stores here. That's not accounting for any natural factors. That's not accounting for any sort of transportation issues, any temperature control issues. And so by the time that somebody has potentially hit deliver or whatever, or pickup or whatever it's going to be, you might have half that food. You might have a third of that food. If half of it's molded, has it touched the other half? So there are all these things that don't truly translate off the app into real life. And so that's where I think technology hasn't done what I think people thought it might be able to do for the issue of food waste. I think in many ways on a farm, it can be incredibly helpful. Certainly inventory management has to have some level of technological management in that way. Certainly we employ a suite of technology to help us do that. But at the end of the day, it really is, some serve safe human accountability to make sure that the food is truly in the shape it needs to be to get to the next person who needs it.
So how do you envision we bridge that gap? Because, we do need the human touch. But technology is advancing at an exponential rate, right?
Right.
Algorithms are written faster than I can blink my eye.
Right.
So how do we bridge that technological gap with the human insights? Does it need more community perspective? Do we need what are some advice there? What can we do to bridge that gap?
Well, so I'm going to say something that's controversial, because it essentially says I would put myself out of business in our current existence. But this work needs to move out of charity. This should be the work of inventory management. It should be the work of justice as it relates to food. Now, we are a long way away from that. But if you look at and I hate using these words in the same sentence or in the same context, because they're wildly different. But if you look at waste management companies, you're dealing with recycling, you're dealing with compost, you're dealing with a suite of services that allow folks to manage product that's post-retail. And essentially, at this level, that's what we're talking about. So without question, there is room for technology to move this food forward, but I think it depends on how do we value this food. I think right now with a lot of those apps, it's more of a like an Uber model, or you get a volunteer to click and say, I'll get that pickup. And at the end of the day, you can't really manage that. If a volunteer, if their car breaks down, if their dog's in the car, if their kid gets sick, whatever, there's somebody waiting for that food on the other end. And so to really understand and put proper value, not just to the food, but to the person who will eventually get it, we have to shift the entire way that we think about food as sort of a measure of kindness, and really as a measure of justice and as a measure of value.
I love that. I'm switching off to one more audience question. We've got some really great engagement coming from our audience today. And that's not surprising, because it's just an important topic for all of us. This question is related to the pandemic and practices that you've implemented to connect and deliver to your consumers. How have you pivoted or shifted? How did COVID impact you, and how did it allow you to pivot to meet the needs while also being cognizant of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I don't think we were unique or alone in being massively impacted by COVID and what it did to us physically, mentally, emotionally, all of that. But a couple of specific things. The first one, you never want to find out this way, but I think we found out, or we understood that we are sort of built in a way that can manage this. We didn't have to pivot our model, right? In a very reductionist and insensitive way, I can say that COVID on the road logistically behaved like sort of the worst intersection of a massive storm, a traffic jam, and a full fleet meltdown. And so those were the changes we had to make. We try to run a pretty flexible model in terms of being able to pivot logistically day to day, or adapt to whatever's happening. So in that way, we were able to respond as necessary. I think at the very beginning, most of us were reading about folks running out of grocery stores with bags of food and empty shelves. And the story there is that folks were running out with massive bags of toilet paper and canned goods, but you never saw empty shelves in the produce section. You never saw empty shelves of the higher priced, more expensive items. And so in that way, our work was not necessarily disrupted. We did see numbers go up during the first and really second wave of hospitality closures. We don't work with restaurants, but we're heavily supported by the restaurant community. We saw people closing their restaurants down, and they had full walk-ins of food that they couldn't prep and serve. So we were working there and doing that. Internally, certainly sourcing PPE was a nightmare. We certainly got help from our partners. We got help from biotech. We got help from folks who had lines into a consistent supply of PPE. We made sure that our executive team stayed in office on a rotating schedule so that our FRCs did not have to come home to come back to an empty office at the end of the day. As a frontline company, we wanted to make sure that our actual frontline was not alone. We created pods, we created testing pools, we created all of the things that we could, literally as things were changing week to week. So in that way, again, I don't think we were unique, but we instituted mental health days, we instituted hazard pay. We wanted to make sure that we were taking care of our team internally so that we could make sure that what was happening in the community could continue to rely on service.
I see that's a testament and reinforcement of needing a holistic community to really make sure you drive your message forward and your values forward. And another question from the audience, and this member says, I know that as summer comes around, kids who would normally benefit from lunch programs at public schools may be left without healthy food options. What can individuals do to serve this population, this unique need?
Great question. And that's something that has existed long before COVID. One of the things that COVID did do, particularly around Boston, was up the sites of meal pickups for families while school was shut down, while there was remote schooling and the like. Project Bread is an incredible resource in Massachusetts, really to be able to highlight those actual pickup points and the drop points where folks can go in their community to understand and really utilize what's available to them. Because when summer comes around, it's one or two meals that those kids are going to be missing, that families rely on. And certainly during COVID, with remote learning, remote work, those resources that were so readily available went away in the easily accessible way that they were.
Yeah. I keep reading that you cannot keep saying what a monumentous time 2020 has been, but I cannot get away from saying that.
Yeah.
Such just a rapid shake to our core of existence. And it is my hope that all the challenges that we face as a community, as a global community as a whole, we come out on the other hand and with more innovation to help us streamline the way that we do work or the way that we just even exist within our communities. So I wanted to pivot a little bit and ask, what are some other opportunities available for people, specifically young professionals in the area, who want to get involved? Who want to get involved in food, helping with supporting their immediate communities with food, and supporting that effort around. I think maybe we may have touched upon this question a little bit, but
yeah, I mean, I would, for anybody who's looking for opportunity or education, I would invite you to reach out. Part of the purpose of our Friends of Lovin Spoonfuls program is to be able to bring folks into the fold, introduce them to the geographies that we work in around the state, what the work actually looks like. And then from there, certainly COVID has forced all of us to institute different ways to engage, right? We were a very event-heavy company, an event-driven company, and hopefully we'll make our way back there. But in the meantime, we're starting to revamp our educational series called Plenty. And we're really trying to make sure that we have engagement opportunities through things like Learning with Lovin, which is an online virtual series where we bring in, speakers, and we have folks representing different parts of our community, different parts of the business community, really trying to keep everybody connected and educated, because I think you're right, 2020 is over. Thank God. But it really was the intersection of so many things that need attention. And if we don't come out of it with a platform to engage with each other differently, I think we've missed that opportunity. So understanding how communities are truly connected, and why we just did one last week on choosing your business partners. And I think half the folks who attended interpreted the sort of title of the session as, you know, a VC and your investor and your founding board. And for us, it was really, who do we work with in the business community as funders, as vendors, and as beneficiaries to make sure that A, we stay healthy as a company, but that we're interacting with the company in a way that offers some visibility and some like 360 you know, ability to know what's happening around us. And I think that's sort of the opportunity that we have.
You actually just touched upon the question and the answer to the question that just came in. And the questions around, is there a good way to integrate corporate partners in highlighting food insecurity?
Yeah, the first thing is talk about it, right? Like identify within your company, identify sort of goals and core values and mission. And ultimately what ends up happening, or at least in our experiences, is, you know, we hear from corporations and foundations whose focus areas match up with our service, or vice versa. We end up being able to make connections and ask folks if they've considered looking at food recovery, because if they weren't necessarily focused in hunger specifically, they may have been focused on environmental issues. And Lovin Spoonfuls is just as active in the environmental space. And so there's so many ways that we look at what different companies do in ways that touch different parts of the community.
It's such it has to be an integrated model for things to work. You
exactly.
have to realize the dependencies and the codependencies of all the systems that make up society to really to push it forward. So with that, with millennials and Gen Z generation becoming the largest generation of decision makers in the business community, what type of change do you hope to see from this group as it relates to the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? And for me, it's so interesting because I won't presume, but I grew up in a generation that didn't have social media, cell phones, things like that. The email was barely a thing. I think it was like prodigy.net or something like that.
Hotmail, AOL.com.
Yeah, something like that. So I think now there's such an developed and expert attention and ability around ways to connect, right? And social media and different ways of sharing information, receiving information, communicating. These are things that can actually be used for good, not just for efficiency, but for good. And so those are the things that I think we're going to see influence not just what people want to do, but again, how they do it. The ideas and the ability to think beyond some of the boundaries that we may have had, you know, as a 2 generations behind or 3 generations behind. There's such a limitless potential at this point to really think about things differently. And I'm particularly excited about that because population is going up, resources are being used at just tremendous
an alarming rate.
Yeah, I mean, just a crazy amount. And so I think we need all the help we can get thinking outside the box and really being able to then whittle it down to say, what are the feasible options here?
Yeah. And as a leader working in this space that people don't necessarily pay attention to, what have you changed your mind on recently?
Oh my gosh.
That's a wonderful question.
Well, my staff would say that I still need to change my mind on Slack. My company uses Slack and I can barely get my text messages open. But I think the idea is always to stay open to anything that comes through the door. And, you know, the remote work piece, I think for me, there was probably a time, and 2020 feels like it was 10 years long, so I don't remember anything before that now, but there was a time where being in office and having a very traditional approach to me meant outcome, it meant efficiency, it meant all of that. And I think what we've seen is the opposite, an incredible ability to connect, which also to connect sort of, remotely, but that actually bred a desire to still come back and connect in person and figure out how to make a balance of both. So I think being able to be open to things that maybe you can't see right away, and then see how it breeds what you originally thought in the first place. It might be where I'm at right now.
As an operations professional, really staying away from dogma, I think is one thing that really motivates me. Being able to be malleable in thought, because there's so much you get to learn. I thrive on, meeting people, listening to ideas for the first time. Sometimes it opens your mind to thoughts that you didn't even perceive was there, and it just all help in effort to advance and help all of us. Yeah.
I think I'm getting it from my wife is an operations person too. So I am being forced by the universe to think differently, but it really is all, there's just such a massive opportunity right now.
So if you had to bring all of this down and boil down to an advice to just one line for the audience today, what would you say? What would you want us to take back as it relates to Lovin Spoonfuls, food insecurity in our community, and just helping for the greater good in general? What would you have us take away from our dialogue today?
Well, so I imagine that there are folks here not in nonprofit and in completely different spaces. And so I would say it's not what you do, it's how you do it, always. There are so many choices in everything that we do that can impact areas and your community in ways you never even thought of. So that's
That's wonderful. I'm just waiting to see if there's a few more questions from our audience. It's been such a dynamic and robust conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been wonderful. And I know that, one second, sorry. I think we actually got through the audience questions. I'm very impressed.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody for their questions.
For sure. And I certainly learned a lot about not just the work that your organization's doing, but what I can take away and impart and advance my community on. So I want to thank you for that, for all that insight that you've provided for us today. Unfortunately, we're slightly out of time. But before we close, I want to highlight that the Boston Chamber of Commerce and the City Awake have a packed digital calendar upcoming. The City Awake is currently accepting applications for our 2021 Fierce Urgency of Now Festival. It's a festival that focuses on connections, access, and exposure for young professionals of color. So head to cityawake.org for more information. And on June 9th, the Chamber is hosting a conversation with the Attorney General, Maura Healey. And on June 23rd, the Chamber is hosting a conversation with Mayor Kim Janey. And with that, I thank you again to our speakers and, of course, our wonderful and gracious sponsors. Signing off now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.